The boardroom door slammed with a finality that felt like a sentence, the heavy mahogany echoing through the glass corridor louder than any stock market crash, louder than the frantic typing of 100 assistants, and louder than the small, confused whimper of the 4-year-old girl standing on the sidewalk. In one sudden, brutal moment, a brilliant single mother in a simple white blouse was cast out into the cold by a man who believed her motherhood made her a liability, a nobody who had overstepped her bounds. What Chris and the silent board members didn't realize was that the next 11 minutes would become the most expensive mistake in their company's history. That morning had begun like every morning for Ellie. It was a blur of balancing a toddler's breakfast with a final review of the tech architecture she had spent years perfecting in the shadows. She had walked into that building not just as an applicant, but as the invisible architect of their success, carrying the weight of her child's future in her hands and a secret in her heart that was about to change everything. Before we reveal the single phone call that turned Ellie from a sidewalk outcast into the ultimate authority, we want to hear from you. We are building a global community here at Blood and Roses Chronicles, and we want to know exactly where in the world you are witnessing this justice unfold. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories of integrity and resilience reach. While you're down there, make sure to like, share this video, and hit that subscribe button to join the fold. Your support is the fuel that keeps these chronicles alive. Now, back to those final 11 minutes. The sun had barely begun to creep over the horizon when the rhythmic hum of the coffee maker signaled the start of Ellie's dual life. In the soft, blue light of 5 a.m., she sat at a cluttered kitchen table, her eyes darting between a glowing laptop screen and a lukewarm cup of tea. On the screen, lines of elegant, complex code scrolled by, the very skeletal structure of the platform Chris would later claim as his own masterpiece. To the world, she was just a mother navigating the exhausting reality of a single-parent household, but in the digital architecture of the industry's most sought-after software, she was the primary ghostwriter, the silent partner who had built the engine while others merely polished the hood. As the city outside began to wake, so did the heartbeat of her world. A soft shuffle from the hallway preceded the appearance of her daughter, clutching a worn teddy bear and rubbing sleep from her eyes. The transition was instantaneous and seamless. Ellie minimized the window containing millions of dollars worth of proprietary logic to open a tab for a preschool weather chart. She moved with a practiced, weary grace, lifting her toddler onto the counter with one arm while toggling a final deployment script with the other. Her life was a constant exercise in high-stakes multitasking, a quiet war fought with diapers in one hand and data encryption in the other. Every sacrifice she made that morning was measured by the dream she had nurtured alongside her child. While she tied shoelaces and packed a small lunchbox, her mind was miles away, calculating the final move of the presentation she had prepared for the board. She wasn't just walking into that room to ask for a job. She was walking in to reclaim the soul of the company she had founded in a garage before Chris had ever heard its name. She dressed in a crisp blouse that felt like armor, smoothing her hair into a low, practical bun that signaled a woman who had no time for vanity. She looked into the mirror, not seeing a nobody, but seeing the architect who knew every structural weakness of the building she was about to enter. As she buckled her daughter into the car seat, she whispered a promise that this would be the last day they spent in the shadows. She didn't need a loud voice to be powerful. She had the truth, the tech, and a maternal resolve that no corporate executive could ever hope to dismantle. The glass doors of the corporate headquarters slid open with a whisper, welcoming Ellie into a world of polished stone and refrigerated air that felt 1,000 miles removed from the warm, chaotic kitchen she had left an hour before. She walked through the lobby with her daughter's small hand tucked firmly in hers, her posture upright and her gaze fixed forward, ignoring the curious, judgmental stares of the morning commuters. To the people in the elevators, She looked like a woman who had lost her way on the path to a daycare center, but beneath her calm exterior, Ellie was mapping the digital pulse of the building. Feeling the familiar hum of the servers she had helped design vibrating through the very soles of her shoes. When she reached the top floor, the atmosphere shifted from the frantic energy of the lobby to a heavy, suffocating silence. The boardroom was a cathedral of chrome and dark wood, dominated by a massive mahogany table that seemed to swallow the light. Ellie entered quietly, taking a seat at the far end of the long table, while the members of the board filtered in like shadows. They were men and women in neutral suits, their faces frozen in a mask of professional detachment that hovered somewhere between pity and boredom. No one offered a greeting. They simply looked at her, then at her child, and then back at their tablets, as if her presence were a glitch in a carefully calibrated system. Their silence wasn't just a lack of speech, it was a wall of institutional complicity, a collective decision to look away from the human element in favor of the bottom line. Then, the heavy double doors at the head of the room swung open, and Chris marched in, radiating the kind of false authority that only comes from a man who has never been told no. He didn't just walk, he occupied the room, his dark tailored suit and polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he took his place at the head of the table. He didn't look at Ellie at first. Instead, he leaned forward aggressively, shuffling a stack of papers with a theatrical flourish that was meant to intimidate. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were dismissive, sweeping over Ellie's modest blouse and her daughter's coloring book with an intensity that bordered on contempt. He looked like a man who confused position with power, unaware that the woman sitting in the cheap seat at the end of his table held the keys to everything he thought he owned. The air in the room grew thin as he cleared his throat, the tension coiling like a spring, while Ellie remained perfectly still, her hands relaxed and her chin level, watching the man who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Ellie stood slowly, her movements fluid and devoid of the frantic energy that usually filled the room when Chris spoke. She moved to the head of the table, her small laptop looking like a toy against the sprawling mahogany, but as she opened her files, the screen displayed the proprietary core logic that powered the entire firm. She had barely uttered the first sentence of her presentation, a breakdown of the structural flaws in their current expansion, when Chris's palm hit the table with a crack that made the water glasses jump. He didn't just interrupt, he sought to annihilate. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, and he leaned so far over the table that he invaded Ellie's personal space, his finger pointed like a weapon inches from her chest. He mocked the simplicity of her attire, sneering at her shoes, and then turned his vitriol toward the child sitting quietly in the corner, declaring that the boardroom was for predators, not playdates. The air in the room turned ice cold as Chris called her a nanny playing at being an executive, his voice dripping with a condescension that felt like a physical weight. He didn't look at her proposal. He looked through her, as if she were a transparent obstacle to his morning schedule. The silent board members shifted in their seats, some staring at their polished shoes while others watched the spectacle with a detached, clinical interest, their collective silence acting as a permission slip for Chris's cruelty. No one moved to defend the woman who had spent years as the invisible architect of their success. When Ellie tried to regain the floor, her voice steady and calm, Chris let out a short, bark-like laugh that cut her off mid-syllable. He signaled to the heavy doors, and two security guards, their expressions grim and robotic, stepped into the room. The humiliation was surgical and public. Chris ordered them to clear the trash and escort the distracted mother from the premises before she wasted any more of the company's billable hours. He made it clear that her very presence was an insult to the professional standards he believed he upheld. As the guards moved toward her, Ellie didn't flinch or plead. She didn't raise her voice in protest or look to the board for a mercy that she knew wasn't there. She simply closed her laptop with a soft click, gathered her daughter's hand, and met Chris's gaze with a level, unreadable stare that should have been a warning. He felt he had asserted total dominance, unaware that by throwing her out, he was effectively handing her the motivation to dismantle his world. As she was led out past the sneering executives, the injustice of the moment burned with a white-hot intensity, setting the stage for the 11-minute countdown that would redefine the meaning of power. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors closing behind her was not an end, but a signal. Ellie stood on the sun-drenched sidewalk, the cold corporate air of the lobby replaced by the humid, living breath of the city. Her daughter, sensing the shift in gravity, gripped her hand tighter, but Ellie's touch remained steady, a tether of absolute calm amidst the storm of public humiliation. She did not cry, nor did she look back at the glass tower that had just spat her out like a broken cog in a machine. Instead, she sat on a weathered stone bench, placed her laptop on her knees, and checked her watch. 11 minutes. That was the window she had given herself to bridge the gap between being an outcast and being the owner. She pulled a slim, encrypted phone from her bag, the one Chris never knew existed, and dialed a number that connected her directly to the heartbeat of the global markets. When her broker answered, Ellie's voice was like tempered steel, devoid of the hesitation she had shown in the boardroom. She didn't ask for permission, she gave a command. She directed the immediate execution of a series of kill switch options and a massive block buy of the remaining floating shares she had spent years quietly tracking. As she spoke, her fingers flew across the keyboard, authorizing the transfer of a liquid capital reserve that had been accumulating since her first lines of code became the company's backbone. She was no longer a mother pleading for a seat at the table. She was a sovereign power reclaiming her territory. Around her, the city moved in a blur of indifference, but on that bench, Ellie was a fixed point of intense calculation. She watched the live tickers on her screen as the company's stock began a sudden, violent dance, a reaction to the massive shark bite she was taking out of its equity. Every second that ticked by was a nail in the coffin of Chris's ego. She thought of the silent board and the way they had looked at their shoes while she was escorted out, and she felt a cold, professional clarity. This wasn't about revenge, it was about the restoration of integrity. She was purging a toxin that had made the business she loved unrecognizable. With one final keystroke, the transaction was complete. The digital ink was dry, and the ownership of the skyscraper behind her had shifted as quietly as a shadow at noon. She looked down at her daughter, who was watching a ladybug crawl across the bench, and finally allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The 11 minutes were up. Ellie stood, tucked her phone away, and adjusted her blouse with the same precision she used to align code. The security guards still stood at the entrance, their faces masks of indifferent authority, but Ellie walked toward them with a gravity that made the air feel heavy. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She was the majority shareholder now, and the building she had been thrown out of was officially her home. As she approached the revolving doors, she wasn't just returning to a boardroom, she was returning to a throne. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and the hollow residue of a victory that felt more like a burial. With Ellie gone, the tension had dissipated into a jagged, uncomfortable ease. Chris leaned back in his leather chair, his feet nearly propped on the table she had just been forced to vacate, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips as he poured a glass of sparkling water. He began to speak of streamlining and removing distractions, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world had been reset to his preferred settings. He treated the recent expulsion as a minor clerical error that had been corrected, a necessary unpleasantness to maintain the sanctity of their professional environment. Around the table, the members of the board remained a portrait of institutional complicity. A few nodded along with Chris's bravado, their faces carefully neutral, while others stared at their reflected images in the polished mahogany, refusing to meet each other's eyes. They were the architects of this silence, a group of high-level professionals who had traded their moral courage for the safety of the status quo. Not a single voice rose to question the cruelty they had just witnessed or the loss of the brilliant mind they had allowed to be escorted out like an intruder. Their detachment was a collective choice, a silent agreement that Ellie's motherhood made her an acceptable sacrifice for the sake of corporate focus. They prepared to sign the documents Chris shoved toward them, ready to finalize a future built on the very arrogance that was currently hollowing out the company's foundation. The silence of the board was more than just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a vacuum where leadership and empathy should have been. They discussed the quarterly projections and the acquisition of new patents, completely oblivious to the fact that the proprietary rights they were debating were tethered to the woman they had just shunned. Some checked their watches, thinking of lunch reservations, while others adjusted their conservative ties, smoothing over the internal ripples of discomfort with the practiced grace of the elite. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their decisiveness that they failed to notice the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way the server lights on the wall began to pulse with a new, frantic rhythm. Outside the heavy doors, the world was changing, but inside the lion's den, the lions were asleep, draped in the false authority of their titles. Chris raised his glass in a mock toast to new beginnings, his laughter ringing out with a brittle, glass-like quality. He believed he had won, that the nanny was a distant memory fading on the sidewalk below. He did not know that the silence he had enforced was about to be shattered by the very person he thought he had silenced forever. As the board members picked up their pens to sign away the company's soul, they remained blissfully unaware that the chair at the head of the table no longer belonged to the man holding the glass. The rhythmic chime of the executive elevator cut through the boardroom's self-congratulatory atmosphere like a lightning strike in a clear sky. Chris froze, his glass halfway to his lips, as the light above the double doors transitioned from a standard white to a pulsing, deep violet, a priority alpha override that few in the building even knew existed. The board members exchanged quick, nervous glances, their practiced masks of indifference cracking as the heavy mahogany doors, which had so recently shut Ellie out, now swung open with a slow, mechanical grace. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy silence of complicity, it was the breathless, hollow silence of a vacuum. Ellie stepped back into the room, her daughter still holding her hand, but the woman who had left 11 minutes ago seemed to have been replaced by a force of nature. She didn't rush. She moved with a quiet gravity that made the room feel smaller, her footsteps clicking against the marble with a terrifying precision. The security guards who had originally escorted her out now stood at the periphery, their heads bowed, their tablets showing the same high-level clearance alert that had granted her passage. She looked exactly as she had before, the same white blouse, the same low bun, yet she carried herself with the stillness of a predator that had already won the hunt. Chris's face turned a shade of pale that matched his expensive dress shirt. He tried to stand, but his knees seemed to betray him, leaving him half-hunched over the table. He fumbled for words, his false authority crumbling into a stutter as he demanded to know how she had gotten back in. He reached for his phone to call security, but the screen was dead, replaced by a scrolling log of the hostile takeover that had just stripped him of every shred of leverage. Ellie didn't even look at him at first. She walked to the window, gazing out at the city she had just conquered with a single phone call, her presence radiating a hidden authority that made the board members instinctively pull their chairs back to give her space. The shift in the room was visceral. The board members, who had previously treated her as a distraction, now watched her with wide, terrified eyes, realizing in waves that the woman they had mocked was the primary source of their company's lifeblood. They saw the priority alpha status on their own screens, a digital crown that designated her as the new majority shareholder. Ellie finally turned, her gaze sweeping over the table not with anger, but with a cold, observant clarity that seemed to read their very souls. She had already won, and she knew it, the board knew it, and Chris, trembling at the head of the table, was finally beginning to understand that the nanny he had thrown out was now the only person who could decide his professional fate. Chris let out a sharp, brittle laugh that sounded more like a cough than a gesture of amusement. He remained hunched in the executive chair, his fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the mahogany edge of the table. "Back for your purse, Ellie," he sneered, though his voice lacked its previous thunder, wavering with a desperate, frantic edge. He looked around the room for support, but the board members were no longer looking at him. They were staring at their own devices, their faces drained of color as the reality of the internal server alerts began to sink in. Chris tried to muster his old arrogance, leaning forward to bark another order, but the words died in his throat as Ellie reached the head of the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With a slow, deliberate motion, she placed a slim folder of physical documents onto the table, the sharp thud of the paper against the wood echoing like a gavel in a silent courtroom. "No, Chris," she said, her voice a calm, level frequency that cut through the tension. "I'm back for my desk." She slid the top document across the polished surface toward him. It wasn't a resume or a proposal. It was a certified notice of a majority share acquisition, finalized 3 minutes prior. The false authority he had worn like a cloak for years began to disintegrate in real time. He stared down at the black ink, his eyes darting across the figures and the legal stamps that signaled the end of his reign. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy vacuum that seemed to suck the air out of the lungs of everyone present. The silent board watched in a state of suspended animation as Ellie walked around the high-backed leather chair Chris was still occupying. She didn't ask him to move. She simply waited, her presence radiating a quiet gravity that made his continued presence in that seat look like a pathetic act of squatting. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that the very air in the room seemed to bend toward her. Chris looked up at her, his jaw working silently, his intense, confrontational eyes now clouded with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, sharp terror. He was seeing, for the first time, the woman who had already won. As the realization of his total loss took hold, Chris's hand trembled, knocking over the glass of water he had poured moments before. The liquid spilled across the mahogany, seeping toward the edges of the very contract he had been so eager to sign. It was a messy, undignified end to a morning he thought would be his crowning achievement. Ellie looked down at the mess, then back at the man who had called her trash just 11 minutes ago. She remained perfectly still, her chin level and her shoulders squared, a portrait of the hidden authority that had finally stepped into the light. With a shaky breath, Chris pushed himself back from the table, the heavy chair screeching against the floor, and stood up. He stepped aside, finally clearing the path to the head of the table, as Ellie prepared to reclaim the legacy she had built in the shadows. Ellie took her seat at the head of the table, her presence filling the vacuum left by Chris's retreating ego. She did not gloat. Her face remained a mask of structured, professional gravity, her high cheekbones and steady eyes reflecting a soul that had learned patience long before it earned power. Her daughter sat quietly beside her, a living reminder of the stakes that had driven this transformation. Ellie looked out at the board members, the silent many who had watched her humiliation with cold interest or cowardly detachment. She did not see leaders in them. She saw the institutional complicity that allowed toxicity to thrive. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was not a scream of revenge, but a measured toll of accountability. She addressed the room with a quiet authority that made the board members instinctively straighten their postures, though their eyes darted with a sudden, sharp fear. She spoke of the responsibility of leadership and the moral decay that occurs when a business values a loud suit over a brilliant mind. She reminded them of their silence when she was being escorted out, a silence that, in her eyes, was as loud as Chris's insults. It was a failure of the most basic test of humanity. Then, she turned her gaze toward Chris, who was standing by the periphery, his jaw tense and his breath shallow. The stocky executive who had once leaned forward aggressively now looked brittle, his navy suit feeling like a costume that no longer fit. Ellie signaled to the security guards, the same men who had been ordered to clear the trash just minutes before. Her instruction was brief and controlled. She didn't need to point a finger. The guards already knew their duty. They stepped toward Chris, their expressions robotic and serious. The irony was heavy in the refrigerated air. The very men he had used as weapons of humiliation were now the instruments of his own professional execution. There was no dramatic explosion, only the sound of polished leather shoes shuffling toward the door as Chris was led away, his false authority finally stripped bare. With the room cleared of its primary toxin, Ellie turned her focus back to the board. She made it clear that a company could recover from a hostile takeover, but it could never recover from a loss of integrity. Effective immediately, she announced a full internal review of the leadership tier. Those who had remained silent would have to reapply for their roles under a new system built on empathy and accountability. She was not just cleaning the room, she was purging the culture. As the board members began to realize the weight of her words, the atmosphere shifted from fear to a profound, sobering realization. The nobody they had ignored was now the architect of their future, and the era of loud, cruel power was officially over. The boardroom, once a cathedral of cold judgment, felt lighter as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, golden streaks across the mahogany table. Ellie remained at the head of the table, not as a conqueror, but as a steward. Her first decree was not about profit margins or market share. It was about the fundamental recalibration of the company's spirit. She spoke of a new era where brilliance would no longer be measured by the volume of one's voice, but by the integrity of their contributions. The era of the lion's den was over. In its place, she was building a sanctuary for innovation where no one would ever have to choose between their career and their character. The board members who remained watched her with a newfound, sobering respect. They saw a leader who didn't demand attention through intimidation, but who commanded it through an unshakable sense of purpose. Ellie outlined new policies for flexible work and family-friendly environments, making it clear that the humanity of the staff was the company's greatest asset. She was transforming the very building that had tried to reject her, turning every brick into a testament to the quiet courage she had carried for years in the shadows. The atmosphere was no longer suffocating. It was filled with the tentative, hopeful energy of a system finally breathing for the first time. Later that evening, after the last of the legal advisors had left and the quiet hum of the building had softened into a peaceful silence, Ellie sat on her daughter's bed. The weight of the day was finally beginning to settle, but it wasn't the heavy, crushing weight of grief or passive struggle. It was the solid, satisfying weight of a promise kept. She looked at her daughter, who was tucked under the covers, still clutching the same worn teddy bear she had held on the sidewalk earlier that morning. Ellie leaned down and whispered an apology for the chaos she had witnessed, but her daughter simply reached up and hugged her tightly. The little girl didn't see a hidden billionaire or a corporate mogul. She saw the woman who had stood tall when everyone else stayed seated. "I'm proud of you, Mommy," the little girl whispered before drifting off to sleep. In that moment, every risk, every sleepless night at the kitchen table, and every second of that humiliating 11-minute wait felt entirely worth it. Ellie realized that she hadn't just bought a company, she had secured a legacy of strength for her child. She had taught her daughter that being kind and being silent are not the same thing as being weak. As she walked out of the room, Ellie looked toward the future with a level, unreadable gaze, knowing that the world might still try to underestimate her, but they would never again be able to ignore the signal she held. If that final moment of Ellie reclaiming her seat at the head of the table sent a chill down your spine, then click that like button right now. Subscribe to Blood and Roses Chronicles to join our community for more cinematic journeys into the shadows. Drop a comment below and let's talk about that hard-earned justice. Remember, The world might see someone silent or broken when they look at you today, but never forget, you hold a signal that can change everything. See you on the next one.